Hello and welcome back to the channel, everybody. I am your host, Vortex, from MobileMusicPro.com, your home for mobile music production. And if you are new to the channel, what we do here is release weekly videos teaching people how to produce music on their iOS device. And in today's video, we're going to be showing you how to make your MIDI sound much more natural and realistic right after this. And remember folks, if you do enjoy this content, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. Now we actually have a ton of different videos dealing with MIDI already on the channel. From how to use free MIDI packs like ours to compose songs, to creating specific MIDI effects like strumming, arpeggiating, and more. But in this video, I wanted to specifically focus on just showing you how to make your MIDI sound less robotic and more human. And to do that, we're going to be exploring a few different forms of very different but very important kinds of expression, including sustain, velocity, and automation, as well as adding some additional effects on there too. Now, of course, it's always a good idea to use the most high-quality virtual instruments that you can find with the most amount of high-quality sampled sounds. For today's video, though, we're actually just going to be using the stock instruments inside of Cubasis 3, just to illustrate how important expression and dynamic range really is. Because if you are using all of these techniques properly, you should be able to get a pretty decent sound out of just about any virtual instrument. And so, without further ado, let's hop right into Cubasis and start trying to make this MIDI sound real. Now, though this tutorial is being created inside of Cubasis 3, the techniques that you'll learn in this video actually is applicable to pretty much any DAW on any platform. Now, we're going to be starting out with a MIDI chord progression found in our completely free Modern Pop MIDI pack. But then we're also going to use a previous project that we created to demonstrate multiple instruments at the same time. And finally, this tutorial assumes that the MIDI that you'll be working with wasn't actually played in, but rather drawn in or came from a pack like you can find on our website. Alright, now let's go ahead and take a look at our very first type of expression called sustain. Now, sustain is essentially how long a note is going to be held. And we can demonstrate what that sounds like for you real quick right now using our sustain pedal that you can't see right now on the camera. So here's what the piano sounds like without sustain. And here's what it sounds like with sustain. And then when we let go of the pedal, the sustain is removed. So the sustain is a very, very important part of expression when it comes to pianos. Now let's take a look at this MIDI progression, again, that you can find in our completely free Modern Pop MIDI pack. And let's hear this dry without sustain. So it doesn't sound too horrible, but it still sounds pretty fake. If we open up our chord progression here, we can see that everything looks pretty good here. We have good chords, good chord progressions, good voice leading, with the bass notes on the octave, and so on and so forth. But yet still, it doesn't quite sound real. So what we want to do is add sustain to this MIDI. And not only add sustain, but we actually want to automate it, so that it happens automatically for us. Now to do that, we're going to explore all of our automation options here that is right below the MIDI. So you have your standard MIDI notes right here, and then beneath that, we have our automation. So what we're going to do is tap down here, and then we're going to find our CC64 sustain, as CC64 is where Cubasis stores its sustain automation. Now when it comes to sustain, you pretty much have it or you don't. It's pretty much on or off, so it's very binary. Now you can easily have sustain on all the time by tapping on the draw note here and just having one at the beginning and then one at the end. But what this ends up doing is it actually has your sustain bleeding in from one chord change to another. And that can sound pretty muddy and actually end up messing up your mix. So what we actually want to do is only draw in the sustain for every chord change. Or in other words, we want to pump that sustain pedal in between those chord changes. So first, let's quickly erase the points that we already created by untapping draw, selecting them, and then tapping on erase. Now let's tap on draw once more, and again start out with just 0 here, and then set it to full sustain so that you can hear the effects immediately after that. And actually we need to move this over one more. Select it and move that over to the left. There we go. So now you can see we do start with 0 right at the beginning, and then we move it immediately up to the most sustain that we can have. And now let's tap our draw again, and draw another point right here. And then we can just simply draw another one as the next chord comes in. I didn't draw that quite high enough. Let's move this a little bit to the top. There we go. Now as you can see, the sustain is enabled for this entire chord, or this entire bar, and then we drop it off right before the end, and then we're going to start it up again with the next chord change. So that means that we're going to need to draw these different points right about here, and right here, and right here. Again, every time that we change the chord. So let's begin drawing in those real quick right now. I'm just going to draw in a couple more, and then I'll fast forward it. All right, there we go. We have now drawn in all of these automations. And as you can see in the beginning, it is set to 0. And then we pump it up all the way to the full, and then we set it back to 0. Now, it is very important, again, that if you want to remove the sustain, that you do have to set it all the way down to 0. Because if you set it to 1 or 2, you're still going to hear some sustain. So in order to completely remove it, you do have to make sure that this number is down to 0. Now, how can you tell that it's 0? Simply by tapping on it once, and then long tapping, and it will give you the number here on the left-hand side. And on a side note, you can see here on the far left-hand side, this is the rest of the CC automation options. So it goes pretty much to as high of a number as you need. But right now, we're just using that 64 sustain. Now that we do have our sustain automation drawn in, let's hear what this sounds like. So it definitely sounds much better already. And let's just quickly do an A/B test so you can hear the difference. So first we'll start out with that dry one again. And then in the middle of it, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the sustain. So let's hit play. Here is the dry version first. And here is the sustain version. So a very subtle difference, but definitely something that you can hear sort of subconsciously. And as we always say on the channel, it really is a bunch of these, really a ton of these different little techniques that when added up all together, really start to make a pretty big change. And real quick, one last tip before we move on to the next section, and that is that you generally don't really want to apply sustain on short notes or what's known as staccato notes. And if you're not quite familiar with what that means, we can just play that real quick for you. Those staccato notes are these quick notes. But you certainly do want to use it on these longer types of chords. And the next technique that we're going to cover to make your MIDI sound more real is something called velocity. Now, velocity is essentially how hard you strike the notes. So you can start out very quiet and then go very loud, something like this. So you can strike them very quietly, or you can strike it very loud. So again, how hard you strike those notes is really going to bring the mood and feeling into the sound. That dynamic range, the difference between the loud notes and the soft notes, is how you musically tell a story. So when they're all the exact same velocity, which most MIDI is, especially when you draw it in manually or grab one from a pack, it's usually all set to the exact same velocity. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So if we open up our chord progression here, we have our notes here at the top, and then our velocity and automation here at the bottom. So let's tap on the bottom and zoom this out a little bit so you can see. Now, as you can see here, every single note is set to the exact same velocity. It's completely straight and square all the way across. And the reason why this isn't good is because you have to put yourself in the position of a real piano player. And when they start playing different notes, it's really never the exact same velocity. Especially when you do various different strums on the keyboard like this. That wouldn't sound right, or that wouldn't sound the same if they were all struck with the exact same velocity. Now you can easily adjust the velocity of individual notes or multiple notes at the same time. So to adjust just a single note, we'll tap back on the piano roll and then select one of these notes. Now we'll go back to the velocity by tapping down here. And you can see this note is now selected in black. And we can zoom in a little bit more so you can see. Now to adjust this up or down, you simply drag it up and down, like so. So we can make this all the way up to the top, 127, or we could put it all the way down to 50. Now if you do want to adjust multiple notes at the same time, we'll tap back in our piano roll here, and let's select all the notes in this chord here. There we go. So now we have multiple notes selected. We'll tap back to our velocity, and you can see here multiple notes are indeed selected, and you can see that by their color difference. They are black compared to blue. And now we can begin dragging these down or up, whatever we'd like to do. Now you might be thinking, that is pretty detailed, like that is a lot of work. And the truth is, yes, to make things sound real, you do have to put in a lot of work. Because that's really what real life is it's just a ton of different details, from the solar level all the way down to the microscopic. And this concept doesn't apply just to music either. For example, if you're doing visual effects or designing 3D models and 3D textures, in order to make something look more real, you want to put a bunch of imperfections on there, such as dust, scratches, and fingerprints, because those imperfections are what makes something look real or sound real. Now, you will find most of the MIDI in the MIDI packs that we have on our website at MobileMusicPro.com already have adjusted velocity, and that's because they were actually hand played in by the producers that we've hired to create the packs. So let's show you what that looks like by opening up that progression. So let's close this out. We'll mute the sustained, and we'll go to the velocity. Let's open up this MIDI. And now if we expand this out, you can see that these notes are in different colors. For example, this note right here is much brighter than this note right here, which is much darker. And this is how Cubasis indicates velocity to you. And as you can see, all of these have slightly different colors. So if we look at the velocity down here, you can indeed see that each one of these keys are in a different velocity. Now let's go ahead and A/B the difference between these two progressions. So first we'll start out with the MIDI that has all the exact same velocity, and then we'll show you what it sounds like with the proper velocity in it. All right, let's hit play. Now let's hear the velocity version. All right, there is definitely a difference there, and you can most certainly hear that if you are wearing headphones. You just have to pay attention to those extra little notes. You can hear that some of those transition notes are definitely quieter than the rest, which gives it a much more human feel. All right, and now the final technique that we're going to show you before we move on to the next section of strings and multiple instruments is going to be adding different effects. So we have a couple of different effects on this piano. We have our standard channel strip here, which is going to give us just a little bit more volume. And then we have our studio EQ, which is going to put this instrument in its proper frequency range. So you can see we're cutting out the lows here and bumping the mid-highs and dipping the highs just a little bit. And then after that, we have a couple of send effects. The first is going to be a compressor, which is going to be using the slow release preset. And you typically want a slower release on things like pianos with a lot of sustain and strings. And then after that, we have our reverb, which is going to be the RoomWorks SE plugin. And then finally, we have a chorus on here, which is going to be using the default preset. So the first thing we're going to do is listen to the previous progression with all of the sustain and velocity inside the MIDI. And then we'll show you that exact same progression, but with all of these effects. So let's hear the first one now and hit play. So starting to sound pretty good there. And now let's hear it with all these different effects. So starting to sound really good there. In fact, it's almost starting to sound good enough for you to just be able to drop that in a mix. Because in modern production, there is effects on pretty much every single track, even if it's just a studio EQ. For pianos and strings, it's generally a good idea to apply a little bit of reverb, not a whole lot depending on the genre or the type of vibe that you're going for, but at least a little bit to give it that realistic sound to make it sound like it's in a real space. And you can always adjust any of these different plugins to taste to fit the exact vibe that you're going for. Here we are just using these stock plugins, but there are some pretty sophisticated plugins out there from a bunch of big-named reputable companies. Now, if you are using the stock instruments inside of Cubasis 3, there is one more setting that you should be aware of, and that is the release setting, because essentially all the instruments inside of Cubasis 3 are sampled in, and these are all played back through a sampled instrument called the microsonic. And this release setting here can really go a long ways in making your piano sound more real. So what we're going to do is start all the way at the beginning, and then adjust it a little bit more to the right. And really, for me, the sweet spot I find is usually around 0.55. So let's hear what this sounds like. You want to be careful to not go too far, because if you have a bunch of effects, all of that is going to bleed in together and create a bunch of mud. But let's hear this one more time with around 0.55 release, and let's hit play. Alright, sounding absolutely beautiful, and definitely more real than what we started out with. So once you start stacking all these different techniques like sustain, velocity, release, and various different effects, you can really start to dial in a pretty humanistic sound. And the next technique that I want to talk about to make your MIDI sound more real is using multiple instruments. And what I mean by that more specifically is using multiple instances of the same instrument, but then using techniques like volume and panning to seamlessly blend them together to create an overall more fuller sound. So this is a bit of a cinematic project that I did a little while back, and it's going to consist of strings, a piano, a string lead, some brass, and some cinematic hits, or cinematic percussion hits. So let's scroll to the top and focus on the strings right now. Now, though this is audio, I actually froze these tracks, so this is originally coming from MIDI using a stock instrument inside of Cubasis 3. What I ended up doing for this piece is using a combination of stock instruments and third-party instruments. So I'm using Ravencroft for the piano, I'm using Sample Tank for the brass, and I'm using iSymphonic for the string lead. Now, as you can see, we've labeled these two string tracks left and right, and that is because we are panning these hard left and hard right. We have track 1 right here, and then track 2 right here. And this technique is actually used with real instruments as well. For example, a lot of the times in rock music with guitars, they're going to pan multiple takes left and right. And this is to give you that more fuller sound, to give you more dynamic range, to really make sure the instruments sound their best at every part of the frequency range. So let's just quickly solo these two string tracks together so you can hear what they sound like. Now, in these cinematic type pieces, what you want to do is generally create a homogeneous sound. And what I mean by that is make sure that all the instruments together create this beautiful wall of sound, where no single instrument is poking out from one another. Now, to do that, there are several different techniques in addition to just your basic EQing. And one of those ways is to make various instruments ebb and flow. And this is a really important technique when it comes to strings, because if the strings are just playing that same velocity all the way through, it's going to sound fake. So what you're going to need specifically with string sounds is the ebb and flow of volume coming in and out. Now, we've applied this technique in the automation that we can show you just by clicking on one of these tracks, tapping on automation, and then opening up our volume. So as you can see here, in addition from bringing the volume from nothing to something, we then have this additional automation here. And I drew this in here to make sure that the strings ebb and flow with the rest of the tracks. And I have done that here with both of these string tracks. We can open up the second one and see that the automation should be exactly identical. Now, if we open up another string track here, this is the string lead. Let's open up the automation. You can see here that we let it build and build and build, and then crescendo a little bit, and then come back down, and then build again towards the end. Again, very, very important to ebb and flow for string instruments. And I just want to remind everybody that this is all MIDI. This was all recorded in with pure MIDI. There was no real instruments that I sampled and recorded into Cubasis 3. This is all just using MIDI and virtual instruments. But when you do start combining some of these techniques, like that ebb and flow for your strings, and creating multiple instances of the same instrument, you can really create that full big range sound where the average person might not be able to tell. And of course, pretty much every instrument has different techniques and different ways of playing it. For strings, for example, there's a ton of different playstyles like legato, pizzicato, staccato, and so forth. But for now, let's go ahead and hear what this piece sounds like. I want you to pay special attention to a couple of different things. And that mainly is that ebb and flow of these different instruments, how one comes in and builds for the next. So let's hear what it sounds like. Alright, there we go folks, that is pretty much all the techniques that we have for today. I really hope that the next time you start drawing in your MIDI notes, or the next time you're using MIDI from a pack, that you keep these techniques in mind. Because I guarantee you that when used properly, they definitely will help your music sound much more professional and much more realistic. Alright, and now it's time again for our final thoughts. And if you are still rocking with us, then we just can't thank you enough for being here, and we especially can't thank those enough that are here every single Wednesday and Friday to watch our live streams and our live premieres. Now we hope that this video didn't bog you down with too many details, because what's the most important at the end of the day is not really making good music, it's just making any music at all. And of course, to have fun while doing it. Sometimes it does get easy to put a ton of friction between you and your music by forcing a bunch of arbitrary rules and processes on yourself. But it is also important to remember that it is some of these very rules and processes that will take your music from an amateur level to a more professional level. And finally, we did just get to celebrate our 2-year anniversary of Mobile Music Pro during last week's live stream, where we got to have a ton of fun interacting and having a conversation with everybody who joined in on the Discord. And we also gave away a couple copies of Cubasis 3, so congratulations to those 2 winners. And if you didn't win, don't worry, because we will be having a ton more contests and giveaways in the future. And speaking of which, we also have a ton more content coming your way as well, so if you do want to keep up with everything that we're doing over here at the channel, definitely make sure to sign up for our completely free mailing list at MobileMusicPro.com. And so, until next time everybody, keep talking music, we'll see you later. Hey everybody, Vortex here, and if you're not aware yet, we now have over 100 fully edited mobile music tutorial videos. And we make music every single Wednesday live on our channel right inside of Cubasis on our iPad. Plus, we also have a bunch of free sample packs, guides, and more at our website at MobileMusicPro.com/free. And so if you are into that sort of thing, producing music on your iPhone or iPad, then definitely make sure to subscribe and check out the rest of the videos on the channel that we know you'll love.